The espresso machine hissed. Caliph moved. 2 tables cleared, 1 order placed, no words spoken. Just hands. Just motion. Just the quiet system he had built so carefully over 3 years of working the morning and evening shifts at Harbor Drift Cafe in Port Valmere. Nobody looked at him twice. That was the point. He wore his notebook on a cord around his neck, a small black thing with a worn cover. When customers needed something, he opened it. When they read what he wrote, they either nodded or waved him off. Either way, they forgot him before he reached the counter again. That was fine. Caliph Doss had stopped expecting to be remembered a long time ago. Port Valmere was not a gentle city. It sat between the industrial harbor and 3 mafia territories like a bruise between fingers, always pressed on from every side. The city had rules that no law ever put on paper. Omegas did not speak unless spoken to. Omegas did not own contracts. Omegas did not refuse. They moved through the city like background noise, assigned to families, sold to businesses, transferred between powerful hands the same way property changed owners after a storm. No ceremony. No protest. Just paperwork and a number. Caliph wiped down the counter. The cafe owner, Marvelbun, a wide man with a permanent sweat line along his collar, stood near the back office pretending to check his phone. He had been pretending for the past 40 minutes. Caliph noticed but said nothing. He never said anything. That was not a choice. That was biology. His voice had never worked properly, not since birth, something his mother had called a quiet gift and everyone else had called a defect. He refilled the sugar dispenser on table 4. A woman with 2 children didn't look up. He moved to table 7. An older man reading a folded newspaper shifted his elbow to block the space Caliph needed to reach. Caliph reached around him silently. The man never noticed. The cafe smelled like coffee and brown sugar and the particular kind of tired that working people carry at the end of a shift. Caliph liked that smell. It was honest. It did not pretend to be anything fancier than what it was. Then the front door opened. Not with noise. With pressure. The air changed first. Something thick and electric moved through the room the way a weather shift feels before rain actually starts. Caliph's hand paused on the sugar dispenser. He turned. 6 bodyguards entered first. Black suits. Earpieces. Eyes moving across the room like searchlights. 2 positioned themselves at the door. 2 moved to flank the booth along the far wall. 2 stood near the counter. Every movement was coordinated, practiced. Then 3 men walked in. Silver hair. All 3. Same height, same broad shoulders, same bone structure down to the jaw. Identical in the way that made people stare and then immediately look away, as if looking directly at them too long cost something. Black suits. No ties. Watches that probably cost more than the entire cafe building. The room responded without anyone deciding to respond. An Omega near the window lowered their head to the table. 2 customers at the bar slid off their stools and moved toward the back without being told. Marvelbun stepped out of his office, saw who it was, and went completely still. Caliph had heard the name before the way everyone in Port Valmere heard names they never wanted to say out loud. The Triplet Alpha Kings. Varric. Syrian. The Los. 3 brothers who ran one of the most powerful mafia dynasties in the Harbor District. Not separately. Together. Always together. The city had stories about what happened to people who tried to play one against the other. Nobody told those stories more than once. Caliph stood with the sugar dispenser still in his hand. He did not lower his head. Not because he was brave. Because he was looking at something else. Something he had not expected. One of the 3 men, Varric, the tallest, the one whose presence hit the room hardest, had a child beside him. A boy. Small. Maybe 5 years old. Dark eyes. Dark hair. Pressed little suit that someone had clearly put effort into. And the child was trembling. Not scared of strangers the way most small children got nervous in crowds. trembling the way someone trembles when they have been crying for a long time and the crying finally stopped but the body hadn't caught up yet. Calith's chest pulled. He set the sugar dispenser down quietly. The child sat down next to Varric in the large corner booth. A bodyguard placed a menu on the table. Nobody moved toward them. The two other waitstaff on shift had both found reasons to be somewhere near the back kitchen. Marvel Bun had not moved from his spot near the office doorway, but his color had changed significantly. Calith looked at the child again. The boy stared at the table. His hands were folded in his lap and he was still shaking. Hi viewers. Have you ever seen a child that sat in public and felt like you had to do something even when nobody else would? The alpha pheromones pressed against the room like a hand pushing down. Heavy. Suffocating. Any other Omega in Port Valmir would have stayed exactly where they were. Eyes down, body still, waiting for the powerful men to leave. Calith looked at the small, shaking child one more time. Then he picked up a clean tray, and he walked toward the corner booth. Because something about that boy's silence looked familiar. And Calith Doss understood silence better than most. What he did not understand yet was why Marvel Bun. The moment Calith took that first step forward, turned back to his office and quietly closed the door, like a man who had already made a decision, and did not want to watch what happened next. The child did not look up. Calith stopped 2 feet from the table. He could feel it now. Close. The alpha pressure from the 3 men was not just heavy, it was layered. 3 separate sources of dominance stacked on top of each other like heat coming off asphalt in summer. His lungs registered it. His pulse registered it. Every Omega instinct he had fired at once, all of them saying the same thing. Back up. Head down. Walk away. He did not walk away. He looked at the boy. The child's small hands were still folded in his lap. He hadn't touched the menu. Hadn't looked at the table settings. A glass of water had been placed in front of him by a bodyguard, and the water was untouched, the ice already beginning to shrink. Nobody at the table had ordered. Nobody at the table had spoken. The 3 Alpha Kings sat in perfect stillness. Varric on the left, closest to the child. Syrian in the middle. The Los on the right. They watched Calith approach the way you watch something unexpected. Not with threat, but with careful attention. Calith reached into the front pocket of his apron. He always carried 2. A habit from a year ago when a little girl had dropped her cookie on the floor near the counter and cried about it. He kept 1 in his pocket after that, just in case. He set the small sugar biscuit on the edge of the table. Not in front of the alphas, in front of the child. He did not make eye contact with any of the 3 men. He did not reach into his notebook. He simply placed the biscuit down the way you set something near a frightened animal carefully without pressure, leaving space. Then he stepped back and waited. The child didn't move. 1 second. 2. 3. The entire cafe was silent now. Nobody pretending anymore. Every person in the room watching from their peripheral vision the way people watch something they know could turn dangerous. Too afraid to look directly but unable to look away. Then the boy's eyes moved. Down to the biscuit. He looked at it for a long moment. He reached out. Slowly. Carefully. Like something being offered might still be taken back. He picked it up. And bit into it. And for the first time since he walked through that door, the trembling in his small shoulders stopped. He chewed. Slowly. His eyes closed once. Then opened. He looked up at Calith. And smiled. It was a small smile. Quiet. The kind that lives on a child's face before the world teaches them to hold their expressions back. Genuine and unguarded and gone in a second. But fully real while it lasted. The room went still in a different way. Not the tense stillness from before. Something else. Heavier. Like the air before a sky changes color. Because people in Port Valmir knew about the child. Everybody knew, though nobody talked about it loudly. The Triplet King's ward. A boy who had not spoken to anyone outside of the three brothers in over 7 months. Not to staff. Not to bodyguards. Not to the parade of therapists and specialists their security team had reportedly brought in from 3 different cities. He did not respond to strangers. He did not smile at strangers. Not once in 7 months. Until a mute cafe worker set a biscuit on a table and stepped back. Caliph looked at the boy. Just looked at him, soft and even, the way he looked at most things, without urgency, without agenda. The child held the biscuit with both hands now and ate it with the kind of focus only small children manage. Then Caliph felt it. A shift in pressure. He looked up. Varric was looking at him. Not the way the room had been looking at him, sideways and nervous. Not the way Marvel looked at him, through him, past him, the way the cafe owner had looked at Caliph for 3 years without once actually seeing him. Varric was looking at him directly. His silver eyes were steady. His expression had not changed exactly, but something behind it had. A door had opened somewhere behind those eyes, just a crack, and what came through it was not anger. It was not irritation. It was not the cold territorial warning that alpha kings gave when something in their space didn't belong. It was interest. Precise. Focused. The kind of interest that comes when a person sees something they did not plan to see and cannot immediately explain. Syrian, seated in the middle, tilted his head slightly. The Los, on the right, had both hands flat on the table now and was watching Caliph's face with an expression that Caliph could not read at all. The child finished the biscuit. He looked up at Caliph one more time. Then he tugged very lightly on the sleeve of Varric's jacket and pointed at Caliph. Varric's expression shifted again. Still controlled. Still impossible to fully read. But his jaw moved once, like he was processing something that arrived without warning. He looked at the child, then back at Caliph. His voice, when it came, was low. Quiet in the way powerful things go quiet when they are paying full attention. "What is your name?" It was not a question with a rising tone. It was a statement with a blank space at the end where an answer was expected. Caliph reached for his notebook. He opened it. He wrote 2 words and turned it to face the table. Caliph Doss. Varric read it. His eyes moved back up. "You work here." Caliph nodded once. Syrian leaned forward slightly. His voice was different from Varric's. Smoother, like something practiced. "You're not afraid," he said. It was an observation, not a compliment, not a challenge. Just a fact being placed in the room to see what happened to it. Caliph looked at him. He wrote in his notebook again. Turned it. He was hungry. 3 words. That was it. The table held that for a moment. Then the Los exhaled slowly through his nose, and for 1 second, something shifted in the pressure filling the room. Not completely, but enough. The smothering weight of 3 alpha dominance pheromones lifted, just slightly, like a window cracked open. It was so small a change that no one else in the cafe likely registered it. But Caliph registered it immediately, because that kind of release was not reflexive. That was intentional. One of the most feared alpha kings in Port Valmir had just deliberately lowered his pheromone pressure in response to a mute cafe worker with a sugar biscuit. Caliph did not understand what that meant yet. He would, but not tonight. Tonight, the child tugged Varric's sleeve again, softer this time, and pressed his small head against the alpha's arm. And Varric placed one large hand gently over the boy's dark hair, and did not take his eyes off Caliph. Back in the corner near the office, Marvel Bun was still behind his closed door. On his desk was a phone call he had already taken, and a number that had already been wired. The cafe closed at 10. Caliph wiped the last table, stacked the chairs, clocked out on the old punch machine near the back door, and walked home through the harbor district the way he always did. Head slightly down, pace steady. Taking the long street instead of the alley, not because the alley was dangerous, though it was, but because the long street had a bakery that left their exhaust fan running all night and the smell of bread and warm sugar at 10:30 in the evening was one of the few things that made the walk back feel like it belonged to him. He lived in a third-floor walk-up on Marsh Terrace. The building had no elevator. The hallway light on the second floor had been out for 11 months. The landlord had a policy of replacing things the day after someone moved out and not a day before. Caliph had stopped expecting that to change. He unlocked his door, pushed it open, reached for the lamp switch, stopped. The lamp was already on. Not because he left it on. He never left it on. He was careful about the power bill the way people who count every dollar are careful about everything small. He stepped inside slowly. Nothing appeared moved. His small kitchen was as he had left it. The dish rack had 2 cups and a bowl. The counter was clear. His worn couch had the same pillow he had left in the corner of it. But on the table, the small round table he ate at and sometimes used to write in his personal notebook, the one with the green cover, not the work one, there was a folder, thick, legal-sized, the kind that came from an office, not a printer at home. He crossed the room. He picked it up, opened it. The first page was a contract, typed in tight formal language that ran down the page in dense paragraphs. Caliph had seen Omega contracts before. Every Omega in Port Valmir had seen one at some point, usually theirs. The language was always the same: transfer of designated status, legal binding clause, right of use and assignment. The words dressed the transaction up in corporate language, but the transaction was always the same. A person being handed to someone else. His eyes moved to the line near the top. Designated Omega, Caliph Doss. His own name. He read it again. His name. His pulse climbed. He flipped forward looking for the seller field, which would tell him who filed the contract and activated the transfer. The line was there. He read it twice. Marvel Bun, the cafe owner. Caliph stood very still. 3 years. 3 years of arriving early, staying late, covering shifts, communicating through a worn notebook without complaint. 3 years of being the employee Marvel never thanked and never fired because Caliph was reliable in the way that silent things are reliable. They stay. They work. They don't ask questions. And Marvel had sold him. Caliph turned to the buyer field. The line was blank. Not unfilled. Blank. As in, someone had deliberately removed the information, printed the contract with the buyer line blacked out in heavy ink. Which meant the buyer had power enough to demand privacy. Which meant this was not a routine transfer. He lowered the folder. His hands were not shaking. That surprised him a little. His chest felt tight, but his hands were steady. Maybe because some part of him had always understood that his safety in this city had a ceiling. That it was borrowed stability, not built stability. That at some point, Port Valmir's rules would apply to him the same way they applied to every other Omega who had thought they were too small to matter. The price field was not blacked out. He had not read it yet. He looked now. He read the number. He read it again. It was not a normal Omega transfer sum. Normal transfers ran between 5 and 15,000. Enough to clear a debt, cover a season of losses, satisfy a creditor. This number had 6 figures. Before the comma, he set the folder on the table. His mind moved through it carefully. Marvel had been stressed for months. The cafe had fewer customers than it used to. Marvel never talked to Caliph about business, but Caliph watched, and what he watched told him enough. The supply invoices had been cut. The good coffee blend had been replaced with a cheaper one 3 months ago. 2 of the 4 staff had been let go quietly. Marvel was in trouble. Deep enough trouble that someone had offered him a number so large he had said yes before thinking through what yes meant. Or maybe he thought through it completely. Maybe that was worse. Caliph folded the contract and placed it back in the folder. He looked around his apartment. The lamp light, the 2 cups in the dish rack, the green notebook on the table beside the folder now. Then he heard it. A knock. Not the way neighbors knocked. Those were loose, casual 2-3 taps. This was a single knock. Firm. Deliberate. The kind of knock that did not carry a question inside it. He walked to the door. He put his hand on the knob. He did not open it yet. Through the thin wall he heard it. A low sound from the street below. He crossed to his window instead and looked down. 3 black SUVs. Parked in a row along Marsh Terrace like they were always meant to be there. Engines off. Doors opening. And 3 men stepped out onto the sidewalk. Silver hair. Black suits. Caliph opened the door before the second knock came. He did not know why he opened it. He knew who it was. He had just watched them step out of 3 black SUVs from his window. Every Omega in the city knew what the Triplet Kings showing up at your door meant. It meant something had been decided above you, without you, and you were the last person to hear about it. He opened the door anyway, because the folder on his table had already told him the decision had been made. Standing in the narrow hallway were Varric, Syrian, and the Los. 2 bodyguards visible in the stairwell behind them. The hallway was not built for 3 large men to stand in comfortably, but they stood as if the space had expanded to fit them, the way powerful people move through small spaces without apologizing for taking up room. They were not in the same black suits from the cafe. Different ones. Equally precise. Varric had his hands at his sides. Syrian had one hand loosely in his jacket pocket. The Los looked past Caliph into the apartment briefly, a single sweep, cataloging. Caliph stepped back. Not because he was asked, because it was his apartment and he was choosing to let them in, and the difference between those 2 things mattered to him even if it mattered to no one else. They entered. The apartment felt smaller immediately, not just because of size, because of pressure. The alpha pheromones filled the space the way smoke fills a closed room. Not aggressively, but completely. Caliph stood near the kitchen counter. He looked at them. Varric looked at the folder on the table. He did not touch it. He simply registered it the way someone registers a thing they already knew was there. You read it, Varric said. Caliph nodded. All of it. Caliph nodded again. Varric shifted his gaze to Caliph's face. Full attention. No warmth in it, but no cruelty either. The kind of focus that belongs to men who have spent years reading rooms and people the way others read whether. Then you understand your position. Caliph reached for the notebook around his neck. He wrote. He turned it. I understand someone sold me. I don't understand why you're here personally. Syrian looked at the notebook, then at Caliph. We handle things ourselves. That told Caliph something. Not everything, but something. Varric moved to the table. Not to sit. He stopped beside it, facing Caliph from across the small kitchen space. I have a question, he said. One question. He paused. Something in that pause was not intimidation. It was more careful than that. Why did you feed my son? The room held that. Caliph looked at him. He did not look away. He reached for the notebook. He wrote. He turned it to face the room. He looked hungry. 3 words. The same 3 he had written at the cafe. Because that was the whole answer. There was no strategy inside it. No calculation. A child looked hungry and Caliph had something in his pocket that could help. That was it. That was the complete transaction. Syrian read it. His expression shifted slightly. Not dramatically. Just a small recalibration like a man adjusting an estimate he had walked in with. The Los looked at the notebook for a longer moment than the others. Then something happened that Caliph did not expect. Syrian exhaled slowly, and the pressure in the room dropped. Not completely, but a measurable drop. Like 2 levels of a building disappearing from a structure that was still standing. Syrian had lowered his pheromones. Deliberately. This was the second time tonight a member of the Triplet Kings had done that. In Port Valmir, Alpha Kings did not reduce their pheromone pressure around Omegas. The social hierarchy ran entirely on that pressure. It was how authority was communicated without words. Lowering it voluntarily in the presence of an Omega was not common. It was almost unheard of. Caliph noticed. He said nothing because he could say nothing. But he noticed. The three men exchanged a look. Brief. Something passed between them in that look that Caliph couldn't read. A conversation without language. The kind that happens between people who have been close for so long that sentences became optional. Varric looked back at Caliph. His jaw moved once. "You're not afraid of us," he said. It was the same observation Syrian had made at the cafe. But Varric was not making an observation. He was asking a question inside a statement. He was asking why. Caliph thought about it. He wrote slowly this time. Turned the notebook. "Being afraid doesn't change the room." Varric read it. Something moved through his expression. Not softness exactly. Too controlled for that. But the door behind his eyes opened a little wider than it had been before. Then the los moved. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. He placed something on the table. 2 documents. Cream paper. Heavy stock. Formal seals at the top that Caliph had never seen in person but recognized immediately. Marriage certificates. Both of them. Blank on the signature lines. But everything else was already filled in. The names were already there. His name was already there. Caliph looked at the documents. Then at the los. Then at Varric. Then at Syrian. He waited for an explanation. Because there had to be an explanation. Omegas in Port Valmir were not married. They were assigned. Transferred. Contracted. The idea of marriage between a mute cafe worker and 3 alpha kings was not a real thing that existed in the structure of this city. Varric picked up one of the certificates. Held it in both hands. Read it once as if confirming what he already knew was there. "This city does things one way," he said quietly. "We do things a different way." Syrian added nothing. The los said nothing. But both of them were looking at Caliph with the same careful, measuring attention. Like men who had already made their decision long before they knocked on the door. And were now simply waiting to see what Caliph would do with the weight of it. The room was completely silent. Caliph looked at the 2 marriage certificates on the table. He looked at Varric. He looked at Syrian. He looked at the los. He looked at the certificates again. None of this fit inside the Port Valmir he had lived in for 23 years. Not a single part of it. He knew how this city ran. He knew how Omegas moved through it. They were currency. They were assets recorded in files and transferred between powerful names the way land transferred at auction. The paperwork was always clean because clean paperwork made the transaction easier to defend. Marriage was not in that system. Marriage implied a choice was being made by both sides. Omegas in Port Valmir did not get choices. He reached for his notebook. He wrote 1 line. Turned it. Not accusatory. Just the actual question inside him, stripped of everything else. Varric took the notebook from him gently. He turned it over in one large hand. Looked at the single word. His thumb pressed against the edge of the page slightly as he read it. "Because what you did at the cafe mattered," he said. Caliph waited. "Darian has not responded to a stranger in 7 months." Varric set the notebook back on the table in front of Caliph. "Not one person. Not doctors. Not staff. Not anyone we brought in." He paused. "You set a biscuit on a table and stepped back." And he smiled. The room held that for a moment. Syrian spoke next, his voice lower and more deliberate. "We have a lot of power in this city. What we cannot do is force a grieving child to eat." The Los said nothing. He was watching Caliph's face with the same quiet intensity he had worn since arriving. Reading something. Caliph wasn't sure what. Caliph picked up the notebook. He wrote, "That still doesn't explain marriage. You could have hired me." Syrian almost smiled. It didn't fully arrive, but it came close enough to change his face. "We thought about that," he said. "The city's council would remove you within 3 days. A hired Omega on our estate has no protection. A contracted Omega has limited protection. There is one legal status in Port Valmir that places a person fully under our authority and outside the council's reach." Varric picked up one of the certificates. "This." Caliph looked at the document in Varric's hands. The weight of the room changed. Not heavier, different, like a pressure had shifted direction. He understood the logic. He could follow it. The Triplet kings had a child who needed something they couldn't provide. Caliph had provided it by accident. The only way to protect that resource from the political machinery of Port Valmir was to bind it to them legally, with the strongest binding available. He was the resource. He understood that. He was not angry about it. Being angry required expecting something different, and Caliph had stopped expecting different a long time ago. But he was paying attention, because something else was happening in the room that the logic of protection did not fully explain. The 3 men were watching him, not with the detached focus of powerful people cataloging an asset, with something more careful. The Los, who had barely spoken since they arrived, took one slow step toward Caliph. Not aggressive, measured. He stopped at a respectful distance, which was itself unusual because Alpha Kings in this city did not measure distance for Omegas. Then the Los leaned slightly forward, and he inhaled. Caliph went very still. Varric's eyes moved to Caliph's face the moment the Los did it. Syrian's posture shifted just slightly, the way a person's posture shifts when they're bracing for something. Because scent recognition between an Alpha and an Omega was not something that happened casually. It was biological, involuntary, a deep instinct that predated every mafia structure and every legal contract in Port Valmir. When an Alpha recognized an Omega's scent at that level, it meant something that no amount of power or politics could override. The Los straightened slowly. He looked at Varric. Something passed between them that Caliph couldn't translate. But the room felt different after it. Charged in a way it hadn't been 30 seconds ago. Varric turned to Caliph. He spoke quietly. "Sign one. Not both. One is enough to be legally binding tonight." Caliph looked at the certificates. He looked at the pen Varric placed beside them. His entire life was in this apartment. 2 cups in the dish rack, a green notebook, a lamp he never left on, a job that had just ended in the worst way possible. A city that had never once seen him as anything other than background. And 3 men he had met 4 hours ago were asking him to sign his name beside theirs. He picked up the pen. His hand moved, and then he stopped, because he looked up. All 3 of them were watching his hands. Not his face, his hands, with an expression that Caliph had only ever seen on one other face in his life, and that was the small boy in the cafe who had looked at the biscuit before deciding whether to take it. Like men who wanted something so badly they were afraid to let it show. Caliph looked at them. He looked at the certificate. He signed. And in the back of the room, near the window, none of them noticed the glow of a phone screen from the street below. 3 floors down, a man in a dark jacket had been watching the window, and now he was typing. Fast. Comment below. If you were Caliph, would you have signed that certificate? The gate opened before the SUV fully stopped. Caliph watched it through the tinted window. Black iron, tall enough that the top disappeared past the edge of his view. It swung inward slowly, and the vehicle moved through it, and the gate closed behind them, and just like that, Port Valmir's harbor district and everything in it was on the other side. The estate came into view a moment later. He did not have a word for it. He had seen large buildings before. The Mafia Dynasty towers along the waterfront. The glass commercial blocks near the port. The old colonial-style houses in the upper district that wealthy families had owned for 3 generations. This was none of those things. The main house was stone. Old stone, the kind that didn't get put up anymore, gray and dense and permanent. 3 floors. Wide wings extending on both sides. Every window lit. The drive curved through grounds that had been landscaped with the kind of precision that took a full-time crew to maintain. 2 fountains. Dark hedges cut into clean geometric walls. Stone paths branching off toward structures he couldn't identify in the dark. It looked like a place that had never once worried about being taken. Caliph sat very still in the back seat. Darian was asleep against Varric's arm. The boy had been awake when they left Marsh Terrace, sitting quietly in the third SUV with a bodyguard Caliph hadn't seen before. But somewhere in the drive, the child had tilted against Varric's side and gone under without ceremony, like a small thing that had finally found the right weight to rest against. Varric had not moved, not once during the drive. His arm had stayed exactly where it was, and he had looked straight ahead, and his face had been unreadable, but his arm had not moved. Caliph noticed that. He noticed everything. It was what silence gave you. When you couldn't add to a room with your voice, you learned to read it instead. The SUV stopped. A bodyguard opened Caliph's door. He stepped out onto the stone drive. The air here was different from the harbor district. Less salt, less diesel, more land, more space, the kind of quiet that came from having enough property around you that the city noise couldn't reach. He had 1 bag. He had packed it in 7 minutes while 2 bodyguards stood in his hallway and Syrian waited near the door with the patience of someone who had waited on much larger things. 1 change of clothes. His green notebook. A charger. The black work notebook out of habit. A photograph he kept in the back of a drawer that he did not examine while packing. 1 bag. That was everything Caliph Doss owned that mattered. A bodyguard reached for it. Caliph held on. The bodyguard looked at him. Caliph looked back. The bodyguard let go. Small thing. Didn't matter to anyone watching. But it mattered to Caliph, and he was the one carrying the bag, so that was enough. Inside, the house was warm. That was the first thing. Genuinely warm. Not the dry managed heat of a commercial building. Actual warmth that came from the size of the rooms holding it. The entry hall had ceilings that went up further than he expected. Dark wood floors. A wide staircase. Staff moving efficiently along the far corridor without making eye contact with anyone in the entry. They were taken to a room on the 2nd floor. His room. That itself was strange. His room implied a room assigned specifically to him, not a staff quarters, not a side space near a utility area. This was a proper room. High ceilings. Wide bed. A window that faced the south garden. A writing desk along one wall with a lamp already on. Caliph stood in the center of it for a moment. He looked at the desk. He looked at the window. He set his bag down on the chair near the door. Then Darian appeared. The boy had woken up somewhere between the car and the entry hall, and had apparently refused to go to his own room, because now he was standing in the doorway of Caliph's room in small pajamas, holding a stuffed rabbit by one ear, looking at Caliph with the specific patience of a child who had already decided something and was simply waiting for the adult to catch up. Caliph looked at him. He walked to the writing desk. He tore a small piece of paper from the corner of a sheet. He wrote on it. He held it out to Darian. "You should be sleeping." Darian read it. He walked into the room. He climbed up onto the chair near the window without asking and tucked the rabbit under one arm and looked out at the dark garden. Caliph sat at the desk. He let the boy stay. He did not fully understand yet what kind of household he had entered, what the rules were, how much of his day would belong to him and how much would belong to the 3 men who had brought him here. What he understood was one child sitting quietly near a window, and that was enough to work with for tonight. But on the far side of the estate, in the security operations room, a message was coming through on a private encrypted channel. The head of estate security, a man named Braddock Field, read it twice. His jaw tightened. He did not respond immediately. He looked at the estate cameras on the monitors in front of him, found Caliph's room, watched the still image of a boy in a chair and a man at a desk. Then he reached for a second phone. Because the Mafia Council did not send messages twice. And this one had come with a deadline attached. Remove the Omega before the bond forms. You have 72 hours. The glass broke at 2:14 in the morning. Not a window, something smaller. A motion sensor panel on the east garden wall, cracked precisely to disable the alert without triggering it. Whoever did it knew the system, knew the exact panel, knew the exact frequency. That was the first problem. The second problem arrived 11 seconds later when three figures crossed the garden in full dark, moving low and fast, cutting toward the house's east service entrance. They were inside before the first internal alarm fired. Caliph woke up when Darian's hand grabbed his arm. He had fallen asleep at the desk. He didn't remember it happening. The lamp was still on. His green notebook was open in front of him. Darian was standing beside the chair, no longer sitting by the window, pressing both small hands around Caliph's forearm with a grip much stronger than a 5-year-old had any right to have. The boy's eyes were wide. He pointed at the door. Caliph was on his feet before the thought fully formed. He moved Darian behind him. Then the door to his room opened hard. Not broken open, unlocked from the outside, key or override, and pushed with force. A man in dark clothing stepped through. No uniform, no estate insignia. One hand already reaching. Caliph threw the desk lamp. Not a plan, a reaction. The base of it was solid, and it crossed the distance fast, and it caught the man across the left shoulder hard enough to make him step sideways and lose half a second. Half a second was enough. Varric came through the door from behind the intruder. That was the only word for what Caliph watched next. Varric moved through the room the way a force of nature moves, not thinking about obstacles, just removing them. The intruder turned and was on the ground before Caliph fully registered the sequence of movements that put him there. One bodyguard followed through the doorway, then another. The man on the floor was zip-tied in under 30 seconds. Syrian appeared at the doorway next. He scanned the room. His eyes found Darian first, then Caliph. Something in his face shifted when he confirmed both of them were standing. "East wing is clear," a bodyguard said from the hall. "Service entrance?" Varric said, not looking away from the man on the floor. "Two more. Contained." The Los stepped into the room last. He looked at Caliph directly. His gaze moved from Caliph's face down to his hands. Checking. Then back up. He said nothing, but he stayed in the doorway. Darian had not let go of Caliph's arm through any of it. He was pressed against Caliph's side, face forward, watching with those wide dark eyes. Not crying, not making a sound, just watching. Caliph put his hand over the boys. Varric looked at the man on the floor. "Who sent you?" The man said nothing. Varric crouched down. Caliph could not hear what Varric said next because it was very quiet, almost conversational. But the man on the floor heard it, and his color changed. He talked. Pause on that. Not slowly. Fast. The way people talk when the alternative becomes unacceptable. He said Caliph's name. He said it was a contract. He said the target was the Omega specifically. Not the child. Not the triplets. Caliph. He said the buyer who originally tried to acquire Caliph through Marvelbun's contract had not accepted the triplets' interference. He said the Mafia Council had authorized removal. He said Caliph was now the most valuable hostage position in the city because whoever held Caliph held leverage over the Triplet Kings. A mute cafe worker. 3 years of invisible shifts and cleared tables and nobody remembering his face. Now the most valuable hostage in Port Valmir. Varric stood up slowly. He turned and looked at Caliph with an expression that was entirely controlled and deeply cold. Not cold toward Caliph. Cold on behalf of him. There was a difference. A very specific difference. And Caliph felt it land in his chest the same way he had felt the boy's smile land earlier that night, unexpected and real and larger than the space it should have occupied. The intruder was removed. Bodyguards moved through the hall. Syrian stayed near the door. The Los finally stepped fully into the room and crouched down to eye level with Darian. He said something quiet to the boy. Darian looked at him, then looked at Caliph, then nodded once and let a bodyguard guide him toward his own room. Varric was on his phone. Braddock Fiel, the security chief, arrived 2 minutes later. He stood at the door with a tablet in his hand and his jaw in a specific position that meant whatever he was about to say was not going to make the room easier. "I need you to see something," he said. He handed Varric the tablet. Security footage. Varric watched it. His expression did not change. Then Syrian watched it. Then the Los. The footage showed the East Garden panel being cracked. It showed the angle. It showed the approach route the three intruders had taken. And it showed, clearly, in the 20 seconds before the breach, a figure near the east wall. An estate security uniform, opening the gate from the inside. The attack had not come from outside the estate's defenses. It had come through them. Varric set the tablet down on Calitha's desk. He looked at Braddock. "Find him," he said. 2 words. The temperature in the room dropped 3 degrees. Caliph did not go back to sleep. He sat at the desk with the lamp on and the door closed and the green notebook open in front of him, and he did not write anything in it. He just sat, letting the room settle back into itself, letting his pulse do the same. It was 4 in the morning. He could hear the estate moving. Controlled movement, purposeful, bodyguards repositioning, doors opening and closing in the corridor. The specific sound of an organization recalibrating after something went wrong inside it. His hands were steady. That surprised him again, the same way it had surprised him in his apartment on Marsh Terrace when he read his own name on the contract. He did not know what to do with steady hands in an unsteady situation. He had never been trained for this. He had never asked for this. He had set a biscuit on a table and stepped back and somehow ended up in the middle of a power war he had no tools to fight in. But his hands were steady. He picked up the notebook. He wrote, "I am the reason someone came through that wall tonight." He looked at it. He turned to the next page and wrote, "Which means I am the reason Darian was in danger." He closed the notebook. He set it on the desk. He sat with that for a long time. Across the estate, in the main operations room, the 3 brothers were not sitting. Varric stood at the far wall with both hands flat on the table and every line of his body pulled tight. He had not spoken in 11 minutes. The room around him was full of people who understood that 11 minutes of silence from Varric Aldecoa meant something specific, and none of them were moving faster than they needed to. Syrian was at the monitors. He had pulled every feed from the past 48 hours. He was moving through them with precise, methodical focus, rewinding, pausing, marking timestamps. His face was composed, but his hands on the keyboard moved with controlled force, each keystroke landing with more weight than the action required. The Los was in the corner. He had a name. Braddock had found the internal feed quickly once he knew what to look for. The man in the estate security uniform had been on staff for 4 months. Clean background check, which now meant nothing. Paid placement. Long game entry. The Los held the name on a piece of paper and said nothing for a very long time. Then something shifted in the room. It started with Varric. He pushed back from the table and turned toward the door and then stopped. He turned around. "Where is he?" he said. "Not the traitor. That was already being handled." Syrian looked up from the monitors. "Second floor. His room." Varric was quiet. Then, "Is he hurt?" "No." Another pause. "The boy. Asleep." Checked twice. Varric put one hand over his mouth for a moment. Just a moment. Then it came down. "This matters." And Syrian said, quietly enough that only the 3 of them could hear, "We knew it was happening. Varric looked at him. The reaction we had when they came through the wall, Syrian said. All three of us. You know what that was? Varric said nothing. The Los set the piece of paper down on the table. It wasn't protective instinct from proximity, he said. It wasn't responsibility. It was the reaction. The room understood them even if no one outside it fully could. Alpha bonding instinct was not a system that activated gradually. It did not build over time like trust or affection. It arrived like a circuit connecting. Sudden, certain, biological in the way that breathing was biological, involuntary, and total. When the intruder had reached for Caliph, all three of them had moved before the thought existed. Not because Caliph was under their protection. Because something in each of them had recognized him as theirs. That was the word. Not possession. Recognition. The specific deep instinct that said, without asking for permission, without waiting for logic to catch up, this person belongs with us. They had not spoken about it yet. They were speaking about it now, in the only way the three of them ever spoke about things that mattered, with short sentences and long pauses and the years of understanding that made both mean the same thing. Syrian said, "He still thinks we pity him." The Los said, "He thinks he's a solution to a problem." Varric looked at the door. Then he looked at his brothers. And the Los said the thing that had been building since a mute cafe worker set a biscuit on a table and stepped back. "He's not just under our protection." A pause. "He's our Omega." The room heard it. Varric exhaled once. Slow and controlled. But it came all the way out like something being set down after being carried for longer than it should have been. He picked up his phone. He sent a single message to Braddock. "No one enters the second floor without my direct authorization." Then he walked out of the operations room, down the corridor, and up the stairs. He stopped outside Calitha's door. He could see the thin line of light under it. The lamp was still on. He stood there for a long moment. Then he raised his hand and knocked. Caliph opened the door. He saw Varric. He stepped back. Varric entered the room and closed the door behind him with both hands, carefully, the way you close a door when you don't want the sound to travel. He stood near it for a moment, not filling the space aggressively the way he had on Marsh Terrace. Standing in it differently, he looked at the desk. The notebook was closed. The torn corner of paper Caliph had written on for Darian was still there. "You should be sleeping," weighted down by the edge of the lamp base. Varric looked at it. "He kept the first one," he said. "The note from the cafe." He folded it into his jacket pocket. Caliph watched him. "He hasn't done that with anything before. Not since his mother passed." The room was quiet. Caliph reached for his notebook. He opened it. He wrote. He turned it. "I'm sorry about his mother." Varric read it. His expression shifted in the specific way grief shifts an expression. Not dramatically, just a tightening, a pressure behind the eyes that comes and then is managed. "She was good," he said. "The boy has her eyes." A long pause. "He hasn't let anyone new near him because every new person felt like replacement. Like the world was trying to swap her out with something else." Caliph looked at him. He wrote, "I didn't try to replace anything. I just saw he was hungry." Varric read it. "That's exactly what he needed," he said quietly. He moved to the chair near the window. He did not sit. He stood near it with one hand resting on the back, looking out at the dark garden. The fountain was still running, a small sound through the glass. Then his tone changed. "The council called tonight," he said, "while the security situation was being handled. A formal declaration." He turned from the window. "They want you surrendered. They're calling your presence here a destabilizing factor in existing power alliances. They're using legal language, but the translation is simple. They don't want you bonded to us, because if that bond forms, they lose a pressure point." Caliph stood very still. "We refused," Varric said. He said it the way men say things that are not up for discussion. We refused, and we told them the legal marriage certificate was already filed, which removes their authority over your status entirely. And they responded by leaking your location to 2 additional competing families. He looked at Caliph directly. There will be more attempts. They will not stop at 1. The council has decided that the easiest resolution is your removal from this equation. He paused. And now you know everything. Caliph sat down on the edge of the desk. He was not shaking, but something moved through him, heavy and quiet and large. Not fear, something older than fear. The specific weight of understanding that you have become the reason something terrible might happen to people who didn't choose to be in your radius. Varric, Syrian, the Los, Darian, a boy who had started eating again because of a sugar biscuit. Caliph looked at his hands in his lap. Then he looked up. He opened his notebook. He wrote for a longer moment than usual. He turned it. If I leave, does it stop? Varric's jaw tightened. No, he said. The bond instinct is already active. Leaving doesn't reset that. The council knows it. They're not trying to prevent a bond that hasn't started. They're trying to eliminate a bond that's already forming. He walked closer. Not close enough to pressure the space. Just close enough that his voice came down lower when he spoke. Leaving would not protect us, he said. It would only put you outside these walls alone. Caliph looked at the notebook. He looked at the fountain through the window. He thought about Marsh Terrace, the lamp, the dish rack, the green notebook open on a table beside a contract with his name on it. A city that had moved around him for 23 years without once registering that he was in it. He thought about Darian's small hands around his arm in the dark. He closed the notebook. He nodded once. Varric held his gaze for a moment. He reached into his jacket pocket. He placed a small folded paper on the corner of the desk, carefully, like something that needed to land gently. Then he walked to the door. Get some sleep, he said. The door closed. Caliph looked at the folded paper. He picked it up. He opened it. It was a note, written in a child's handwriting. Uneven letters. A drawing at the bottom in pencil, 3 tall figures and 1 smaller one, and a tiny shape that might have been a rabbit. Thank you for the biscuit. Caliph held it. He held it for a long time. And then he went to the window. He looked out at the estate, the garden, the stone drive, the tall iron gate at the far edge that he could just barely see from this angle, closed, solid, permanent. He breathed. He placed the note on the desk beside his green notebook. He turned off the lamp. And 3 hours later, when the estate was quiet and the guard rotation had just changed and the window on the south wall of his room showed the first thin line of gray that meant morning was coming, Caliph sat up. He turned on the lamp. He opened the green notebook. He wrote for 4 minutes. Then he tore out the page. He folded it. He left it on the desk. He picked up his bag. He walked down the back stairs quietly, past the east corridor, through the kitchen, out the service exit which he had noted the location of when they arrived, because Caliph Doss noticed everything. The morning air hit cold. He walked. He did not look back at the gate. He knew where he was going. He had known since the moment Varric said, "They're not trying to prevent a bond that hasn't started." There was one place in this city where everything had begun. One place where Caliph had always been invisible. And if invisible was what it took to stop the war from reaching the people now sleeping in that house behind him, then invisible was what he would go back to being. He walked through the gray morning. The harbor district waited for him at the bottom of the hill. And the note on the desk said only, "I am not leaving because I want to. I am leaving because some things are worth protecting even when they cannot protect themselves. Thank you for seeing me, even for a little while." The cafe was not open yet. Caliph stood outside on the harbor drift sidewalk in the gray early morning and looked through the glass. The chairs were still up on the tables. The espresso machine was dark. A single overhead light was on in the back near the counter, the kind left on overnight when a building is being managed on a budget that doesn't extend to motion sensors. He put his hand on the door. It was unlocked. Marvel Bun was not there. Maybe gone. Maybe moved on to wherever men who sell their workers go when the transaction doesn't end the way they planned. Caliph didn't know. He didn't spend time on it. He pushed the door open. He walked in. The cafe smelled the same. Coffee and brown sugar and the specific tired warmth of a place that had been running for years on exactly the same rhythm. Caliph set his bag on the counter. He stood in the middle of the room for a moment. No customers. No noise. No pheromone pressure. No legal documents on a table. Just the place he had worked for 3 years, empty and early and quiet. He sat down at the corner table. The large one. The one where they had sat. He placed both hands flat on the surface. He looked at the seat where Darian had been. He breathed. He had been here 40 minutes when the door opened. He did not hear a car. He did not hear footsteps on the sidewalk. The door simply opened, and cold morning air came through it, and 3 men walked into Harbor Drift Cafe at 6:47 in the morning looking like they had not slept. Varric, Syrian, Delos, no bodyguards, just the 3 of them. Black coats over the same clothes they had been wearing the night before. Varric's jaw was set hard. Syrian's eyes swept the room and found Caliph immediately and did not move away. Delos closed the door behind them with both hands. Caliph did not stand up. He sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at them. He had expected anger. He had prepared for it. He understood it. He had left without telling them. He had walked past their security. He had disappeared in the middle of a situation where his safety was the exact thing that had been threatened 6 hours earlier. He expected anger. What happened instead stopped every thought he had. Varric crossed the room. He stopped at the corner table. And he went down on one knee. Not a gesture. A full, deliberate, one-knee drop onto the cafe floor. Right there, in the empty room, in front of a mute Omega who had worked in this cafe for 3 years without anyone registering he existed. Syrian moved to the other side of the table and knelt. Delos came to stand at the foot of the table and knelt. 3 Alpha Kings. On the floor of a harbor cafe at 6 in the morning. Caliph's throat closed. Not with sound. He had no sound. But something inside his chest locked and pulled tight, and his eyes went hot in a way he hadn't felt since a very long time ago. Varric looked up at him. "We didn't come after you because we own you," he said. His voice was lower than Caliph had ever heard it. Not weak. Stripped. Like something with all the performance taken off it. "We didn't save you because we pitied you." He held Caliph's gaze and did not move from the floor. "We came because when we woke up and read that note, not one of us could breathe correctly." Syrian spoke. "We chose you," he said. "You didn't ask us to. You didn't perform anything. You walked up to a table that the entire room was afraid of, and you set a biscuit down and stepped back." He looked at Caliph directly. That was the moment. That was the one. Delos, who always said the least, said the final piece. "You left to protect us," he said. "We understand that. But you need to understand something." He paused. "You are not a variable in our safety. You are not leverage. You are not a hostage position or a political liability or a contract asset." He looked at Caliph with the same steady, reading expression he had worn since the first night. "You are ours, and we are yours, and the council and every family they set against us, and every man they send through every wall we have, none of that changes what is already true." The cafe was completely silent. The overhead light in the back hummed quietly. Outside, the harbor was starting to wake up. Distant sounds. Engines. The first movement of a city going through its morning. In here, none of that existed. Caliph looked at the 3 men on the floor in front of him. He looked at Varric, whose face held something that Caliph recognized now that he had seen it long enough. It was not authority. It was not the controlled expression of a man managing a resource. It was fear, the specific fear of losing something irreplaceable. He had worn that same expression on his face when he put his hand over the boy's hair and did not move his arm during the drive. Caliph reached for his notebook. His hand was not steady this time. It trembled slightly, just slightly, as he opened it. He wrote. He turned it to face them. I didn't think I was worth the war. Varric read it. He stayed on the floor. You are worth every war this city has left, he said. Syrian reached forward and placed one hand over Caliph's on the table. Warm, firm, the kind of contact that does not ask for anything back. Caliph looked down at that hand. He had spent 23 years moving through a city that treated him like background, like furniture that happened to carry trays, like a system that processed orders and cleared plates and never needed to be spoken to directly. Silence had not made him invisible. He had believed that. He had lived inside that belief like a house with no windows. But it wasn't true. Silence had made him the only person in the room still enough to notice a trembling child. The only person calm enough to step forward when the whole room stepped back. The only person whose hands didn't shake when everything around him did. That wasn't invisibility. That was exactly the opposite. The Los rose from the floor. He walked to the back of the cafe without explanation. A minute later, the espresso machine came on. The hiss and pressure of it filled the room. Syrian let go of Caliph's hand but did not step back. Varric stood. He looked at Caliph for a long moment. Then he held out his hand. Open. Offered. Waiting. Not a command. Not a contract. A choice. Caliph looked at it. He thought about Darian's note on the desk upstairs. The uneven letters. The pencil drawing. 3 tall figures and 1 smaller one. He placed his hand in Varric's. And that morning, in a harbor cafe that smelled like coffee and brown sugar and the kind of tired that working people carry and eventually set down, the 3 most feared alpha kings in Port Valmir proved something the entire underworld would never understand. The quietest heart can rule the loudest world. And the boy back at the estate, who had not spoken to a stranger in 7 months, woke up that morning, walked to the security operations room, and found Braddock Field standing over his monitors. Darian looked at the screens. He found the feed from Harbor Drift Cafe. He watched the 4 figures in the corner booth, 3 kneeling men and 1 who sat with his hand extended over the table. And in a voice no one in that room had heard in over 7 months, soft and small and entirely certain, Darian said, "He came back." That note he had left on Caliph's desk was still folded in the pocket of his pajamas. He had not let go of it once. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell so you never miss a story that inspires. Drop a comment and tell us, which moment hit you the hardest? Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that being quiet doesn't mean being forgotten. Your words in the comments inspire more people than you know.